Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and welcome to the first of an only online sermon series. As we are in the new lockdown, this sermon will not be given in shul. It will only be online, but looking forward to seeing you all in good time, wishing you all strength through this lockdown. Also looking forward to hearing Chazan Avrami as he is back on with Kabbalat Shabbat. Today I want to talk to you about whataboutism. You might be familiar with this concept, whataboutism. It goes as follows. When somebody says to you, "How are you behaving in such a manner?" You say, "Well, what about that situation?" But that wasn't what they were talking about. But somehow they've deflected, they've gone on the defensive and said, "What about something else?" The first example of whataboutism occurs in this week's parasha. We have Moses seeing his brother being smitten by an Egyptian and he kills him. The next day he's going out and he sees two Hebrews fighting and he says, "Why are you smiting your friend?" He says, "Well, what about what you did yesterday?" And Moses is like, "Well, I can't deal with this. How do you respond? How do you have a conversation about what's going on now? I'm just trying to break up a fight." And he's saying, "What about the other situation?" That's whataboutism. And that whataboutism is what caused Moses to have to flee from Egypt for some 40 years till the dust settled. This week, we saw a terrible, terrible tragedy at the United States Capitol. A mob descended on the center of the free world, so to speak. And when people ask, well, how could they do it? Suddenly we hear whataboutism. How can you have people riot on the Capitol? Well, what about Black Lives Matter and the riots and the protests that went a little ugly earlier this year? Whataboutism. But at risk of falling into the trap of whataboutism, I want to take things much earlier. Let me be absolutely clear. President Trump is responsible for what happened this week, but it did not begin with President Trump. Let me tell you who the real enemy is. The real enemy is in our midst. Before we do, I want to share with you an idea from today's Daf Yomi, the teaching from the Talmud. The Daf talks about Amei Haaretz. We normally translate that as ignoramuses, illiterate people, but literally it means land persons, people of the earth. So the Talmud tells us a few things about land persons. First of all, La'olam yimkar adam mashiach. A person should always go to the ends of the world, expend all necessary items in order to marry a Talmud Chacham's daughter, a sage's daughter. And he should never marry the daughter of a land person, an Amma Aretz, because they're despicable. Rabbi Lazar said it's permitted to stab, probably ridicule, a land person on Yom Kippur. Why? Because you want to be able to get them to do teshuvah and start learning Torah, mend their ways. You should never take a journey, a trip with the land person, an Amma Aretz, because they don't value what's truly important in life, learning Torah. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says it's permissible to tear open a land person like a fish. What that probably means is to force them to learn Torah. But you see the strong terminology that's being used. Rabbi Kiva says, when I was a land person in Amma Aretz, I would say, "Give me a Torah scholar and I will bite him like a donkey." Rabbi Eliezer responds, "If they didn't need us for business, they would kill us." The hatred which land persons have for Torah scholars is even greater than anti-Semitism, than the hatred the nations of the world have for the Jewish people. This is strong language. The differentiation between the Torah scholars and the Amei Haaretz, the land persons. Why do we call it a land person? Well, it's almost a derogatory term. Our sages were saying, unlike those who are committed to Torah and mitzvot, who value spiritual pursuits, land persons, all they care about are earthly desires. You don't want to be an Amaretz, a land person, or have anything to do with them. But as Rabbi Akiva points out, such tough language doesn't inspire anybody to do the right thing. It serves only to exacerbate divisions in our people. That's why Rabbi Akiva said, love your neighbor as yourself is the most important Torah principle. Why love your neighbor as yourself? In modern academic parlance, we would say don't other somebody who's not like you. They're like yourself. You have to think of the other person as yourself. Once you start othering them, then there's no love, there's no communication, there's no relationship. They have to be as yourself. That's how you have to view them. Sadly, throughout our history, we've found ways to draw lines of demarcation by creating labels of separation. In the times of the Talmud, it was chaver, a friend, versus am haaretz, the land person. At various other times, it's been Pharisee versus Sadducee, rabbinate versus Karaite, Orthodox versus non-Orthodox, Frum versus Fry. Thank God during our history we have had heroes, though, that have risen and said there's no lines of separation. We're going to build bridges. We're going to demolish these false fences that we've erected, from Rabbi Akiva to the Baal Shem Tov. True lovers of man and God. No doubt the Baal Shem Tov would have read this piece of Gemara almost as a piece of satire to provoke self-introspection and think, what are we doing making these lines between Chaverim and Amei Haaretz? There's no such lines. God doesn't see such divisions. Let's return to the tragic events that took place earlier this week. The Baal Shem Tov teaches that any time you see something happen, you have to ask yourself, why has God made me witness to this? What have I done in some way to contribute, or what does it mean to my life? Who is the enemy of the American people today? It's no longer Germany. It's no longer Japan. It's no longer Saudi Arabia. Who is it? Well, it all depends. If you're a Republican, then it's the Democrats. And if you're a Democrat, there's no greater threat to humanity than a Republican-led Congress. That's how Wednesday's tragic events came to pass. Because our so-called leaders have been stirring up hatred and animosity of one citizen towards the other for some time now. But not just hatred. Dehumanization and demonization of the other. It didn't begin with Trump. The awful rhetoric has been on the rise over the last couple of decades. It's shocking to hear the way political opponents and media pundits have referred to presidents or presidential candidates, from Barack Obama to Mitt Romney to Hillary Clinton to George W. Bush. These incredible leaders were reduced to objects of ridicule, or worse yet, evil incarnate. And when we're talking about the potential for evil people to take over the Congress, take over our country, are we surprised when the mob decides to do whatever they can to stop this takeover? Let me be clear. President Trump could have and should have stopped the tragic events, and he is personally responsible for what happened. Sadly, though, what happened is the culmination of decades of terrible rhetoric. The people that entered the US Capitol weren't AK-47 wielding paramilitary members. Most of them, they were unarmed. They were simply a ragtag group of simpletons blindly following a narcissistic cult leader who had told them, you have to be strong. Did you hear the way President Trump himself infantilized these people? Go home now, children. We love you. Even he doesn't have much respect for them. Blind followers. You see, as long as we think about people in terms of us versus them, we will continue sliding backwards into the abyss of barbarism. It's time we remove the false fences we've created in our minds between different kinds of people. We need to start listening to one another and not demonizing them simply because we don't agree with their opinions. May we always view others with compassion, grace, v'ahavta, ahava, love, and tolerance, and may the Almighty in turn shine his countenance upon us and redeem us from the crises in the midst of which we find ourselves right now. Shabbat Shalom, and praying for peace and health.